Introducing Cordina, an interactive emissions benchmarking service for the world's highest emitting sectors. At Cordina, we simplify Scope 3 emissions data to allow customers to see, compare, and explore the emissions that matter to them at different points along a value chain. Emissions up and down the supply chain can account for up to 80% of companies' greenhouse gas emissions footprint. Yet analysing these emissions is exceedingly complex and time-consuming. Cordina coordinates and simplifies Scope 3 data to allow ESG teams, industry bodies, advisory services, and financial institutions to easily benchmark emissions at different points along the value chain. Through proprietary data aggregation and transparent industry standard calculations, we generate a whole new set of high-value emissions insights that were previously hidden in Scope 3 data, which enables organisations to define and maintain credible, cost-effective net zero reduction pathways. We're starting with mining and minerals value chains, namely lithium and then copper, with the intention to expand through other heavy emitting sectors globally. But why the complexity in Scope 3 data, and what is the specific problem that Cordina solves? Well, the problem has genesis in the widely adopted GHG protocol emissions framework. Here we can see Scope 1, the direct emissions from different company facilities, Scope 2, indirect emissions from electricity consumption of those facilities, and Scope 3 emissions, all the other upstream and downstream emissions associated with that company's supply chains. And it's this application of Scope 3 emissions which creates the challenge. When companies collapse all these supply chain emissions into one number, meaning and comparability is lost. For example, emissions hotspots are hidden, and it's difficult to tell if two companies are calculating emissions on the same basis. Let's take a look at the Cordina approach, using lithium as an example. The first thing to note in our Tranche Explorer service is that the emissions along the supply chain are not collapsed into one number, but rather the processing steps or tranches along a supply chain are separated out. Here we can see primary resource extraction, refining, and other manufacturing steps downstream. Each symbol represents the emissions per tonne of product of that tranche or step in the supply chain. We can expand a given tranche in the supply chain to get a clearer picture of performance amongst competitors, which at a high level helps an organisation to level set their performance and ambition versus their peers. With our added analysis of Scope 3 data, we're also able to drill down further into a given tranche to help explain where the differences in data originate from. As we click on a tranche, we can see the emissions broken down into a systematic structure which is similar for each tranche. In the case of the primary resource extraction, we have the embodied emissions of the mine inputs. We have the emissions associated with getting those inputs to the mine, the direct emissions associated with the extraction process, and the emissions associated with transporting the product to the next tranche, as well as other relevant Scope 3 emissions categories for mining. The Cordina team is currently working on a transport calculator feature, which will allow customers to modify the supply chain and calculate changes in carbon footprint based on changing the destination of the product from that tranche. In the example shown, two product destinations are chosen to be reconfigured. This feature will be a useful input into supply chain optimization and net zero planning. So in summary, the Cordina data aggregation and analysis approach not only provides a more coordinated arrangement of emissions and supply chain, but allows for interactive benchmarking and sensitivity analysis. And from our discussions in the industry, we see many different customer groups thirsty for clearer data and insights. the various industrial facilities along the supply chain seeking to reduce emissions in their value chain hotspots, consultants and advisory analysts who are charged with compliance, emissions reduction and benchmarking analysis, all the way through to financiers and portfolio managers who need to understand the emissions competitiveness of their current or future investments. Overall, we see this as a multi-billion-dollar sector with a need for transparent data aggregation and coordination being at the heart of making progress. Progress towards coordinated emissions intelligence. Thank you, Microsoft, for your support of our development so far.